had come. The shadows stretched long blue-black fingers across the ground, distorting the landscape, making familiar shapes seem monstrous and strange. It was during this time, the gold hour, that a new energy stirred in the column, the promise of rest. The end of the day's torture gave them a final surge of strength. The pace quickened slightly, a desperate rush toward the setting sun, a race to secure a patch of ground before the total darkness descended. As the light failed, the colors intensified. Briefly, the dust clouds lit from below glowed orange like banked coals. The distant hills turned to deepest indigo. The air felt suddenly sharper, cooler. This transition was the most beautiful of the day. The moment of hushed surrender when the first stars appeared thin and tentative. They knew they had survived another day. Another measure of league covered another mile eaten. They would sleep on the stone earth beneath the ancient sky, and tomorrow they would wake to the inevitable dust and the endless cold of the east. The cold seeped up through the dry, cracked earth, chilling the mailed flesh. Even before dawn, the deep marrow chill that miles of walking never truly erased. The breath of the thousands was a cloud, a low-moving mist across the desolate plain, a pale banner lifted by the first weak rays of sun trying to pierce the eastern sky. They stirred now, these ironclad pilgrims, pulling cloaks tighter, the rough wool a small comfort against the vast indifference of the landscape. This was 3. The marching had become the only rhythm, the only truth, the endless repetition of left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. They were a river of steel and desperation flowing across the belly of the world, far from the green fields of France, or the rich vineyards of the Rhine Valley now. They were among the hills where the Roman roads were ghost memories, stone etched with the wear of forgotten centuries, but still holding the line of march. The dust rose, first a silent herald of the days. Misery, it was fine beige powder, the color of dried bone lifted by the smallest movement, the shuffle of a leather boot, the creak of a cartwheel, the nervous snort of a burdened horse. This dust coated everything it settled on the edges of the eyes. It filled the mouth, a greedy, constant reminder of their slow, relentless progress, clung to the velvet banners, once bright now faded and torn by wind and rain and the simple friction of passage. Sun climbed higher, a relentless orange orb promising heat, a heat that would bake the sweat into the chainmail, making the heavy armor feel like a second skin of fire. Water sacks were weighed, measured out stingily by the few priests and barons, who maintained some semblance of order, a sip for strength, not for pleasure. The taste metallic warm faintly of the leather carried in. Air was hushed, except for the inevitable sounds of the column beginning its daily resurrection. The clang of metal on metal, a loose piece of harness striking a stirrup, the low commands muffled by exhaustion, the occasional cough, the dry rasping throat clearing of men who had breathed only dust for weeks. They were deeper into the lands now ruled, or at least claimed, by the distant emperor in Constantinople. A strange and glorious figure who spoke a language they barely recognized and worshipped Christ in ways that felt alien and complex. The Greek guides were aloof, careful men watching the Franks with nervous suspicion. These crusaders were allies of a sort, but chaotic, destructive guests, driven by a passion that bordered on madness and ancient, furious belief in the city, waiting at the end of the world. The logistics of moving tens of thousands of souls across hostile or indifferent territory was the true enemy. It was not the Saracen yet. It was the empty pantry, the dry well, the broken axle, the price gouged by a nervous local merchant. The markets they passed through were tense affairs. A handful of silver could buy a loaf of hard bread. But the transaction was swift, cold, conducted with weapons held loosely ready. Locals feared the hunger in the Crusader eye, the raw animal need lurking beneath the cross, stitched onto the shoulder of the tunic. They were constantly moving along the valleys that snaked toward the rising sun, seeking the path of least resistance or the next reliable source of water. Earth here was hard, unforgiving. The stone was gray, ancient, immovable. Every step was paid for in aching muscle and depleted spirit. The barons rode the horses, large, powerful beasts, equally weary their heads, hanging low, their hooves striking the stone road with a hollow thud-thud. But even those who rode were fatigued, the constant exposure to the elements, the unending dust. The nervous watchfulness required sleep was not rest. It was merely the cessation of movement. A few hours of uneasy dreaming, haunted by the ghosts of home and the immediate. Knowing pain of thirst, the squires walked beside the knights carrying the extra gear, the heavy shield. The secondary spear of their youth, providing a temporary resilience that the older men envied. They learned quickly the art of conserving energy, the way to walk without wasting a single movement, letting the momentum carry them forward. They learned the silent communication of the march, the slight shift of weight that meant trouble, the raised hand that signaled a stop, the slow, steady tramp that meant keep going, keep going, keep going. The sound of the pilgrimage was a sound of suffering and commitment. It was the squeal of the ungreased wheels, the leather creaking under the water barrels, the subtle hum of armor plates shifting against the padding beneath. If you closed your eyes, if you allowed the sun to warm your lids and felt the vibration through the solace of your feet, it felt like a single great creature moving across the earth. A slow iron slug, leaving a track of disturbed dust and discarded hopes. Midday came violently. The sun hit its zenith, and all colors seemed bleached from the world, save for the blinding glare of the sky in the dark shadow immediately beneath the mentha. Air itself felt thick, viscous, hard to draw into the lungs. The thirst became absolute, consuming all. Other thoughts, the nights would whisper of cool rivers, of shaded stone, courtyards of ale frothing from the tap. But reality was the dusty road, the sweat stinging their eyes. Mail grew heavy, intolerably heavy. Each link felt like a separate weight dragging them down into the dry soil. Many discarded items they thought necessary just weeks ago. A finely carved wooden cup, a book of prayers, a spare blanket. Anything that could lighten the burden to save energy, to simply move forward, became precious. The road was littered with the ghosts of material possessions, the silent sacrifices to the god of distance and endurance. The discipline began to fray at the edges. A brief scuffle over the remnants of an apple, a sharp word spat between a nobleman and a common soldier, the quiet theft of a handful of oats meant for the horses. Moments of breakdown were quickly suppressed by the stronger leaders' men, who understood that the survival of the whole depended on the relentless maintenance of the line, but the internal erosion was constant, subtle like water wearing down stone. Shadows stretched thin, then vanished entirely, then began their slow expansion as the afternoon wore. On the light turned amber, a deep golden hue that washed over the landscape, making the dry stalks of grass look momentarily beautiful. This was the hardest time, the 3 hours before the halt. The body was screaming for rest, the energy reserves were depleted, and the mind began to play tricks, seeing mirages of lakes where only shimmering heat existed. The thought of Jerusalem, the reason for all this, seemed abstract, distant, unreal. It was replaced by the overwhelming need for the next hour to simply end. They saw a few towns now. They skirted the major settlements, fearful of confrontation or contamination, preferring the loneliness of the march to the chaos of negotiation. They relied on purchasing grain from wary Byzantine agents who met them outside the city walls, transactions beneath the cold eyes of imperial guards who wished them gone quickly. The Byzantine Empire was ancient, intricate, a machine of stone and bureaucracy that viewed the Western barbarians as troublesome, children demanding too much food and causing too much noise. Franks saw the Greeks as soft, effeminate, distant from the true faith of the fighting pilgrim. A deep mistrust lay between the allies, a quiet tension that added another layer of anxiety to the daily routine. They slept in open fields or shallow valleys, forming a great circle of carts and men for protection. The fires were small, low burning, conserving the scarce fuel. The smell of wood smoke was the smell of safety, of temporary home, mingled with the smell of unwashed bodies, of dried sweat, of stale leather and horse manure. As the sun truly set, plunging the sky into a deep velvet blue, the sounds changed. The metallic clang vanished, replaced by the soft whisper of conversation, the muffled lowing of the oxen, the steady chewing sound of those who had managed to find fodder. The stars emerged, countless brilliant points of light cold, indifferent witnesses to the human drama below. Monks would walk through the encampment, chanting low, simple Latin hymns, the sound carrying softly on the cooling air. These were the moments when faith reasserted itself, when the men remembered why they wore the cross, why they endured this punishing physical penance. They looked up at the vast expanse of the night sky and felt a crushing insignificance, but also a sense of divine purpose cloaked in suffering, the thought of the holy sepulchre, the actual stone, the tomb of Christ, provided the anchor, the ultimate destination that pulled them forward, even when their bodies rebelled. It was not a tangible goal like a hill crest or a river crossing. It was a spiritual magnet drawing the heavy iron slug of the army across the broken earth. The dreams that came were simple, violent, exhausting. Dreams of water, dreams of lush fields, dreams of being home and suddenly waking to the realization that home was 1,000 miles behind them and only the hard, dry ground was beneath their backs. The guards paced slowly, figures moving silently through the shadows, their armor faintly catching the starlight. They listened for the sounds of trouble, local bandits, rogue animals, the slow, heavy breathing of the sleeping army itself. The true silence was rare, and when it came, it was almost frightening. The temporary cessation of the sound of thousands of hearts beating in unison. Shift from the physical exhaustion of the day to the mental burden of the night watch was profound. In the day, they battled the dust. In the sun at night, they battled fear and doubt. They wondered if they would truly survive this endless walk, if the stories of the rich East were true, or if they would simply waste away on some anonymous hillside far from God and home. Horses needed constant attention there. Strength was paramount. The farriers worked by the dim light of lanterns, tapping the hot metal of the shoes, carefully measuring the fit. The smell of burnt horn and sulfur hung heavy around the smithy pits, a sharp contrast to the soft, earthy scents of the fields. The men who cared for the animals were vital figures, their patience tested hourly by the nervous, exhausted beasts. Every beast was precious in mobility, a necessary carrier of food and war material. Losing a horse or an ox was a blow to the entire column, slowing the rate of advance, reducing the carrying capacity, increasing the risk of famine. This phase of the journey was defined by attrition, the slow wearing away of resources and morale. The path often followed ancient riverbeds, dry now, but promising water in deeper cuts through the landscape. They moved along the remnants of old empire, following the trade routes that had existed for centuries before the name of Christ was first spoken. The geographic markers began to shift. They left behind the familiar rolling hills of Central Europe and entered a zone of high rock and steep gradients. The climbs were agonizing, the men slipping on the loose shale, the horses struggling for purchase. The descents were equally terrifying, the constant threat of a misplaced step causing a crushing fall under the weight of the mail. The column stretched out dangerously on these mountain paths. Miles separating the vanguard from the straggling rear, communication became almost impossible, reliant only on riders galloping back and forth, risking their lives on the treacherous footing. The commanders worried about ambush in these narrow defiles, where a small band of determined archers could hold up the entire host for days. Political landscape became a maze. They were moving through lands nominally Christian but culturally opposed, where the local population saw the Western Army as little better than a plague of locusts. They were often forced to forage to take what they needed, sometimes violently, resulting in local uprisings quickly and brutally suppressed. The violence bred more violence, the necessity of survival overriding the piety of the pilgrimage. The Crusaders were holy warriors, but they were also desperate. Men hungry and far from the restraints of law, the religious fervor that fueled the march was a double-edged sword. It drove them forward through impossible conditions, but it also justified acts of immense cruelty against those perceived as non-believers or obstacles to the ultimate goal. The priests walked among the columns attempting to maintain spiritual integrity, reminding the knights that their path was sanctified, that every hardship was a trial designed by God. They heard confessions administered, last rites to those who succumbed to fever or exhaustion, and attempted to mediate the constant disputes over food and lodging. Their presence was a thread of order weaving through the chaotic mass of humanity. The very ground they walked on felt older, heavier than the soil of home. The stones were cold, dark, bearing the mark of millennia. They passed ancient stone ruins, monuments left by people's long-gone silent temples, and broken watchtowers that whispered of the instability of empires. It was a humbling realization that their fierce movement, their great mission, was just another fleeting moment in the long history of this earth. Wind sometimes carried the faint scent of the sea, a salty promise that they were moving in the right direction toward the great expanse of the Mediterranean, but the sea was still weeks away, an eternity of walking. They counted the days not by weeks or months, but by river crossings and mountain passes. Geographical boundary successfully navigated. Was a victory a tangible proof that the relentless will of the West was pushing them toward the goal? The armor shone dully, now permanently stained with the dust of 100 different soils. Had lost the polished sheen of parade. It was the working skin of the pilgrim soldier. Every joint, every rivet, every leather strap was known intimately by the man who wore a heavy, uncomfortable, essential shell. The sound of the hammers ringing out in the early morning at the temporary forge was a crucial sound, repairing the broken links, mending the shield boss, straightening the bent sword. The resilience of the metal was matched by the resilience of the men themselves. They learned to endure minor injuries, to walk on blistered feet, to ignore the dull. Constant ache in the lower back pain was simply a condition of existence, not a reason to stop. The sun rose, washing the world in its slow, persistent amber glow, demanding that they rise and move. The water rations were distributed, the packs were hoisted. The shields were strapped on the first few hundred yards with the hardest, the muscles protesting the abrupt transition from cold rest to heavy movement. The body cried, stop, but the will commanded go. They followed the banners, the Greek cloth emblems of the Virgin Mary, the saints, the family crests of the powerful barons, were the visible signs of organization, the points of gravitational pull that kept the immense column cohesive. Great mass began to move, slow, inexorable, powerful. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. The dust rose, the silent cloud of their passage, the inescapable shroud of the Crusader march. They were now truly entering the deep history of the East, crossing the historical barrier between the familiar West and the unknown terrain of Anatolia, which lay far ahead. The challenges were only growing larger, the mountains steeper, the supply lines more precarious, the distance to the holy city, an invisible burden that rested on every shoulder. But they moved through the silence of the dawn, the heat of the midday sun, the cooling shadows of the evening, a river of iron flowing toward Jerusalem. A journey measured not in miles, but in suffering and faith. The sleep would come in the dark hours, brief and restorative, and the morning would demand their relentless labor once more. The weight of the ancient road pulled them onward. The air was stone-heavy thick with the scent of dried mineral, and time itself. Elias stood breathless, suspended between the known world above and this subterranean secret. His lantern, a small, frightened sun, cut a narrow circle of amber light into the hushed darkness. He lifted the lantern, slowly watching the oily light slide over the rough-cut stone walls. This was not the smooth masonry of the surface temple. This was older, deeper, rougher. It felt clawed from the earth, not built upon it. Every breath he took tasted of dust and cold copper. The silence here was a velvet curtain, muffling his heartbeat, his very existence. He began to move forward, placing one boot gingerly before the other. The floor was uneven, a bed of fine silt and grit that whispered beneath his weight. The passageway was narrow, forcing him to brush his shoulder against the ancient stone. Walls began to speak, not in sound, but in shadow. As the light swept across them, he saw the etched lines appearing faint at first, then growing sharper, more deliberate. They were glyphs, but not the script he recognized from the upper ruins. These were earlier, more primitive symbols depicting figures with long, thin limbs facing a distant, unknown star. They seemed to march eternally towards a void. He paused, tracing the cold outlines with the tip of his gloved finger. The stone felt strangely warm. Beneath the dust, a slight residual heat that defied the icy cavern air. It was a heat of memory, perhaps of hands that had carved this history long before written history began. Corridors stretched on, seemingly without end. It wound downward in a gentle spiral, deeper into the earth's core, where light had never naturally reached. He kept his eyes fixed on the carvings. They told a story of passage, of loss of a cloaked object sought across millennia. The figures depicted carrying a burden that glowed with a faint internal luminosity. Was it fire? Was it liquid gold? Was it pure idea? The air shifted, change in pressure, a slight warming that brought with it a faint high scent of dry cedar, and something else, something medicinal, and profoundly old, like pulverized frankincense, stored in deep, dry shadow. He rounded a final corner, and the space opened vast and surprising. It was a circular chamber, not carved like the hallway, but clearly polished and smooth by immense effort. Or perhaps by water over countless ages. The floor here was flat, smooth obsidian, reflecting the lantern light back at him, doubling the fragile illumination. In the center stood a pedestal. It was fashioned from a single dark green stone, almost jade. But denser, heavier, upon the pedestal rested the centerpiece of this entire hidden complex. It was a bowl, shallow, wide, beautifully crafted of pure, thick amber. It did not glow, it merely absorbed the lantern light, holding it captive within its depth. The amber was mottled with streaks of deeper gold, like frozen honey or ancient sunfire. He crept closer, his boots silent on the obsidian. The floor of the bowl was empty, or so it seemed at first glance. He tilted the lantern, raising it high above the artifact. Within the translucent walls of the amber bowl, he saw tiny inclusions. Not dust, not flaws, but minute shape, impossibly preserved. They looked like seeds or perhaps small insects, but they were arranged in perfect geometric patterns around the circumference of the inner surface. It was a map held, frozen in time. A celestial chart, perhaps, of the design of a lost city. Elias leaned in close, inhaling the scent of the amber, which now mingled with the cedar, creating an almost intoxicating fragrance. He reached out his hand, stopping just short of touching the ancient resin. This was the burden the cloaked figures had carried, this vessel of preserved light. He needed to record this. He fumbled in his pack for a sketching pad and stylus, his mind racing, trying to interpret the frozen geometry. But as he looked down at the paper, the light of the lantern flickered once sharply, then steadied, and the hushed silence of the chamber fractured. It began suddenly, a sound so low it felt like pressure in chest, not a sound in the ear, a resonant hum that seemed to originate from the very stone beneath his feet. It vibrated through the obsidian floor into his bones. It was a single sustained note, deep, pure, unsettling. Elias froze. All thoughts of sketching vanished. He held the lantern steady, sweeping the light wildly around the chamber. Walls searching for a breach, searching for the source. The walls remained solid, the stone impassive, etched still, with the stories of forgotten travelers. The sound intensified. It grew slightly higher, a low organ tone that spoke of deep subterranean depths of water, moving of mechanisms long dormant, suddenly stirring. It felt artificial, mechanical, yet profoundly organic, like the breathing of the earth itself. He took 2 steps back, retreating from the pedestal and the unsettling amber bowl. His mind struggled to rationalize. An underground river, perhaps flowing through natural pipes, or a geological tremor causing the chamber to resonate, but the sound was too constant, too perfect for nature. He looked back at the pedestal. The green stone base seemed to shimmer faintly under the influence of the sound waves. Then he saw it hidden beneath the pedestal, where the green stone met the black obsidian floor, was a small, thin line. A hairline crack that was slowly widening. It was not structural damage, it was a seam. Pedestal was turning slowly, deliberately, with the sickening grind of dry metal against ancient stone. The source of the hum was the movement, the colossal weight of the pedestal, shifting, opening something hidden. Beneath, Elias pressed himself against the curving wall, the fear cold blade in his stomach. He was deep below the earth, alone with a moving mechanism that had been silent for millennia. The grinding stopped. The hum died instantly, leaving a sudden, shocking vacuum of silence, even deeper than before. Where the pedestal had been a perfectly circular void now appeared in the obsidian floor. The void was blacker than the rest of the room, blacker than the shadows. It did not reflect light. It consumed. I held the lantern over the edge. The light fell into the pit and disappeared instantly. It was impossibly deep, but the darkness was not complete. From the bottom of the void, which must have been dozens or hundreds of feet below, a faint glow began to rise. It was not the amber glow of his lantern, nor the dull green of the pedestal stone. It was a crystalline pale blue light, cold, luminous, pure. As the blue light ascended slowly, filling the black shaft, he saw that it was reflecting off something wet. Water. This pit led to water, to a flooded passage, or an underground sea, and the blue light was not stationary. It was moving up and down, pulsing like a huge, slow heartbeat. At the base of the shaft, Elias crept closer, driven by an irresistible, hypnotic curiosity. He lowered himself to his knees, peering into the shaft, his own reflection. Momentarily caught in the obsidian floor near the edge, he realized the glow was coming from below the surface of the water. Whatever lay down there was submerged, and whatever it was enormous. Scent of cedar and old spice intensified, overwhelmed. Now by a clean mineral scent of cold-moving water and something metallic, something like old bronze left in salt water. Blue light surged briefly, reaching higher up the shaft wall, then retreated slightly. It was beckoning silent, demanding he could not descend this way. The shaft was perfectly smooth, the walls unclimbable. But the opening of the void had revealed the chamber's deeper purpose. It was a lock, a gateway to something even more ancient than the carvings on the wall. He stood up, wiping the damp stone dust from his gloves. He looked back at the amber bowl resting peacefully on the edge of the moving pedestal. The bowl seemed utterly unaffected by the monumental shifting that had just occurred. He knew he must leave the chamber for now, return to the surface, regroup, and find a way to access that water-filled abyss. The knowledge held within the amber map was surely the key to navigating the blue light below. He turned his back on the glowing void and began the long ascent through the spiraling passage, retracing his path past the etched ancient figures. He kept the lantern high, watching the shadows dance one last time over the figures marching toward the star. They were not merely marching, he realized they were following. They were drawn by the same profound source of light that was now pulsing faintly from the depth below. Air grew gradually cooler as he climbed. The silence of the chamber replaced by the whispering sigh of the upper caverns he had sealed the outer entrance, leaving only the memory of the immense circular chamber below, and the haunting image of the pedestal, shifting the stone, grinding the hum dying. Away now, walking back through the tunnel, the darkness of the passage was less absolute. There was a faint secondary light filtering down from somewhere. Above, not the surface sun, but something intermediary. He stopped. The faint light was illuminating a single small stone set into the ceiling of the tunnel, which he had somehow missed. On his descent, it was a stone of pure crystal, refracting the dim light into 1,000 small spectral arcs. He reached up. The crystal was cold, smooth, sharp. As his fingers closed around it, the secondary light source vanished, leaving the tunnel utterly dark save for his lantern. When he pulled his hand back, the crystal was gone. But etched onto the palm of his glove was a symbol burnt onto the leather by the instantaneous, intense energy of the small stone. It was the same geometric shape he had seen earlier, frozen within the amber bowl, a precise interlocking spiral that meant direction or perhaps destination. He felt suddenly chilled, not by the cavern air, but by the realization that he was not alone in this discovery. Someone or something had left this marker for him, a breadcrumb, leading him further into the hushed shadows of the world, beneath the world. Crystal, the amber, the geometric mark, the enormous pulsating blue light, far below the dark water, all converging now upon single unknown locus. He walked on, listening for the soft scuff of his boots on the dusty floor, trying to ignore the profound resonant silence that swallowed every sound. Faint metallic scent of the deep water seemed to follow him, mingling now with a high sweet note that lingered, perhaps a trace of the cedar, perhaps a hint of the ancient amber itself clinging to his senses. He reached the final rise, the passage narrowing to the point of entry, but as he placed his hand upon the final ancient stone before the ascent, a whisper seemed to touch his ear. It was not a language he understood. It was a sequence of pure tones, soft, musical, deeply ancient. Like the hum of the earth, but personalized, directed, a breath held in time, a story waiting to be told, a journey only beginning in the deep, cold earth, far, far below the sleep of history and the silent vigil of the endless stars. Whispers linger, hushed quiet, cloaked in the fading echo of the turning stone and the distant memory of that rising blue light calling, calling, calling deeper still into the night. Pale gray of morning offered little comfortingly the promise of another mile, another 1,000 steps off, slow unfurling of the road ahead, still cloaked in the residual chill of the earth. They moved before the sun dared lift its full weight. Columns stirring like a tired beast each man, a silhouette weighted down by the iron ghost off the journey. Already lived dust was their companion, an eternal film coating the dry lips, the cracked leather, the very air they breathed. It rose in hushed clouds around the hobnailed boots, a perpetual sigh against the stone and gribble. Only sound besides the measured rhythmic scrape of steel on rock, and this was the rhythm. Now not the glorious clamor of departure, not the frenzied prayer of first zeal, but the dull, inescapable cadence of marching. The heart beat slower now, in deference to the feet. The mind had learned to detach, floating above the physical frame watching. The legs drive forward endlessly. They were walking statues draped in fatigue each face, etched with the growing understanding that devotion was not a burst of fire, but the slow, relentless ache of perseverance. The landscape changed steadily, agonizingly. Slowly rolling plains gave way to low scrubland, then back to wide exposed vistas where the wind cut sharp across the cheeks, scaring the scent of dried herbs and distant fire smoke. Each day was a mirror of the last. Same weight on the shoulders. The same parched throat, same relentless arc of the sun climbing slow into the colorless sky. You learn to walk within yourself to find the hollow spaces in your thoughts where silence resides, away from the heavy breathing and the low murmur of tired. Mente, armor rubbed always in the same place. Small continuous friction beneath the hauberk, a dull pain that became so familiar it ceased to be pain and became simply existence, a marker of the body still. The second task was it was not the sound of wind or water. It was a rhythmic clicking sound, too precise, too measured to be natural, like the slow turning of massive, invisible gears far, far below. He crouched low, peering into the gloom, wondering what waited at the bottom of the long, slow road. The humming of the obsidian continued its promise of knowledge, vibrating into the utter dark of the shaft. The green light dimmed, slowly retracting back into the stone, leaving only profound cold and the measured mechanical click. He was alone at the edge of the pit, the truth of the sunken road revealed, and a long descent waiting for him in a deep velvet dark. The afternoon sun was a brutal hammer pressing the heat deep into the iron. The dry, cracked earth below the march continued relentlessly. A thick, slow river of men and bird and beasts moving through the interior of the ancient land. Anatolia stretched out, unforgiving and vast, a landscape of scorched rock and low yellow scrub where distances mocked the eye. Each footfall was heavy, dull, and repetitive. Sound swallowed instantly by the dry air, a muffled drumbeat of profound exhaustion. The dust rose in slow reddish cloud, settling instantly on sweaty brows and rough woolen cloaks. On the polished surface of helmets, it coated the throat, leaving a permanent taste of copper and fine silt, making the very act of breathing unconscious. Heavy effort towers had melted into a timeless, hazy procession of identical, painful steps miles, unwinding behind them like useless thread. There was no talk, not only the necessary harsh commands, the low murmur of a prayer, half-formed, then forgotten. Hunger was a dull constant, a chest thirst, a stinging dryness that no amount of water could truly banish. Merely soothe for a fleeting moment, they followed the banners. High above the columns, stained, frayed, and heavy with dust, signs of their purpose, signs of their unending journey. The weight of the chainmail hauberk felt like stone settled around. The shoulder-severing movement costing more energy than they possessed. It was the 5th month of the walk-in. Landscape had changed from the green safety of the West End to this harsh domain of sun and stone. Men were cloaked in a perpetual film of grithier faces, burned dark and cracked their eyes, half closed against the glare. Slow creak of the wooden cartwheels, squeak of the leather harness, low labored breathing of the oxen. These were the sounds of the crusading army, now not the fanfares or the eager shouts of departure, but the somber acoustic of survival. Brother Anselm watched the way the dust motestanced in the slivers of blinding sunlight, catching the brief, intense glow before falling back to the earth. He focused on that dance, letting the hypnotic slow swirl fill his vision, distracting him from the persistent ache in his hip. He thought about velvet. Rich, deep blue velvet of the altar cloth back home. He had texture so soft, so utterly unlike the abrasive wool scratching. His neck now velvet meant coolness, meant shadow, meant stillness here. There was only heat and grit and relentless modio and deep motion that felt like the earth itself tilting them eastward. They had lost the count of the days. They had lost the names off the small hostile villages they passed. They only knew the direction the sun gave them, east. The whispered promise of Jerusalem was now almost mythical, a beautiful delusion that kept the mailed feet moving. The horses drooped their heads low there. Coats dull with sweat and grim with air paced slow, deliberate reluctance. Sometimes a man would stumble, heavy boot catching on an unseen stony, a momentary disruption in the slow flow. He would be pulled up immediately, no words exchanged, because falling meant staying, and staying meant death. The air was utterly hushed save for the mechanics of the march. The silence of the vast plains was heavy, profound, a silence that absorbed sound and hope equally. Air itself felt thin, stretched, too tight, lie-like. Old dry parchment ready to tear, it offered no shade, no comfort, no reprieve. Heat rose off the rocks in shimmering waves, distorting the vision of the path ahead, making the horizon seem to swim in a false lake of light. The line of march was impossibly long, stretching back until the human forms dissolved into the amber haze of the distance. They were linked not by friendship or shared stories, but by the shared burden of the heath. Identical rhythmic raising and planting of the feet, Anselm fixed his gaze on the back of the man ahead. A large scarred peasant named Gerard, whose leather baldric was worn thin and shiny with sweat. Gerard. As shadow, a brief dark shape offered a tiny fleeting reference point, a moving patch of relative coolness. The shadows were short, now dense and black, clinging close to the bodies that cast them, a reminder of the sun's high, brutal dominion. In 2 hours, the sun would begin its slow descent in. The shadows would lengthen, beautifully stretching out across the cracked ground, offering the false promise of imminent rest. But 2 hours was an eternity in this heat. Woe hours was thousands more. Steps thousands more. Repetitions of pain and thirst. Anselm shifted the weight of his shield, the wood hot beneath his hand. He pictured the surface of the shield etched deeply with the sign of the cross. The etching was precise, beautiful, a perfect symbol of faith. Yet, here under the real, unending sun symbols, offered little comfort. Only water offered comfort. Only the thought of cool, clean cistern water, which they had not seen in days. They relied on the murky, greenish pools found in the dry riverbed's water. That had to be boiled and still tasted of earth and sickness. The discipline of the march was rigid, established by necessity. And fear, no straggling, no stopping, unless ordered. The enemy was always near, always watching. Turkish horsemen, swift and ghost-like, had been seen on the ridges, lately dark, fleeting shapes against the sky, observing their painful progress. They did not engage in large battles. They merely harassed. They circled. They picked off the weak, the slow, the isolated. This fear was a cold knot tightening in the belly. Despite the heat, they pushed the men onward, the relentless need for collective safety. The collective body of the army was their only defense against the vastness, against the cruelty of the sun and the silent watchers. The stones beneath the boots were sharp, jagged pieces of shale and granite that worked their way through the thin solace of their marching. Boots. Anselm felt a blister throbbing on his heel, a small concentrated point of fiery pain which he chose not to acknowledge. To acknowledge the pain was to feed it to the weakness that demanded they stop, that demanded they lay down in the blessed coolness of the dust and simply cease moving. He focused instead on the smelled, heavy scent of dried scrub and old sweat, metallic tang of hot iron in the air. The heat was beginning to change. The intense, blinding white light was softening imperceptibly. Ting. On a deep amber hue, the color change was minidia. Promise whispered on the edge of the air, a silent signal that the high tide of the day had finally began to recede. Slowly, carefully, the shadows began to stretch, pulling themselves out from beneath the horses' hooves, extending like cloaked figures across the plain. This moment, the transition from blinding day to the promise of a cool night camp, was the most sacred of the day. Men sensed it instinctively, a collective easing of the shoulders, a slight lift of the head. They knew soon the trumpet would sound the signal for the health. Chance to drop the heavy pacto, peel off the hot, suffocating nail, but they did not rush. Rushing was dangerous. Rushing wasted energy. They maintained the slow, rhythmic grind. The line of men stretched onward, a serpent moving over the baking earth, its scales shimmering with the reflection of the declining sun. The light began to slant golden and low, illuminating the dust clouds from the side, turning them into towers of glowing russet smoke. The air was still thick, still hot, but the oppressive direct weight was lifting, replaced by a hushed golden glow. The Colors of the landscape dependent. Pale scrub turned a bruised purple. Distant ridges became etched lines. Of dark velvet, Anselm looked up at the sky, a deep pale expanse of blue fading to gold at the horizon. It was immense, indifferent, unchanging. It reminded him that the earth was vast and their journey was merely a scratch upon its surface. Said to them this scratch was everything. Every breath, every aching muscle fiber was dedicated to this slow eastward creeping. They were moving across the bones of the world. Ancient stones that had seen empires rise and fall there was insignificant yet deeply felt. He could hear the whisper of his own blood, steady, heavy, thrumming behind his ears, drowning out the sound of the march itself. His thoughts drifted to water, not the murky pools, but rushing mountain streams, gold, clean water over smooth white stone. As a sound of pure liquid joy, he focused on the coolness of that sound. Visual image of the claret using it as a mental antidote to the dust and the dryness. The man ahead, Gerard, suddenly coughed, a deep rattling sound pulled from the chest in. The momentary illusion of coolness, shattered reality rushed back, heavy scent of sweat and leather, grit under the tongue. The sun touched the lowest ridge, lit a final glorious burst of deep orange light, casting impossibly long shadows, making the small marching figures seem monumental. Shadows swallowed the small rocks, the scrub creating a temporary plain of soft darkness, a blanket beginning to unfold over the plain. This was the signal, the moment of grace, when the final decision for the camp would be made. No army marched after dark in this hostile land. They needed the safety of the ditch, the watchfires. The light deepened to a fiery copper. The sky was turning an intense, fiery rose and gold. The colors were too beautiful for this suffering place. A cruel masterpiece painted across the horizon. Anselm felt the slightest brush of coolness on his cheek. The air was stirring gently. The day was dying and bringing blessed relief. The trumpet blast finally cut through the hushed evening air, a sharp, clear signal reverberating over the plains. Sound of halt. It was not a triumphant fanfare. It was a simple utilitarian sound. Sound of survival earned for another day. The heavy line of men began to slow. The pace eased. The rhythm, stuttered feet dragged to a stop, unwilling to believe the reprieve. There was a profound collective sigh, a heavy sound of exhaustion released as the men stopped and stood swaying slightly their bodies, reluctant to give up the forward motion. The immediate noise was the clatter of dropped weapons, groan of tired men kneeling on the dry ground. Gentle untying of packs. Anselm let his shield drop with a dull thud and began the slow, difficult process of removing his mail. The links were hot, sticky against his tunic, holding the day's heat deep within the metal. Cooling air felt like a balm on his skin where the mail had held the heat tight. He stretched his neck, the movement stiff and painful around him. The work of setting up camp began swiftly, efficiently, without wasted motion. This was the ritual, the final necessary act before the hard earned rest. The wagons were circled, the perimeter established. The voices were low hushed. The fear of the night was silent but present soon. The cooking fires would bloom, small flickering points of orange light against the vast, deepening blue of the velvet sky. The sky was already turning to indigo above them, first few hesitant stars appearing, small pinpricks of pure cold light so far away from the heat and the dust of the world. Anselm watched the smoke, grizzy, a thin gray column straight up into the still air, carrying the scent of dried wood and necessity. Would eat his hard biscuit, drink his murky water, and then he would lie down a cooling earth. The ground beneath him would feel rough, it profoundly solid, a final certainty in a world of endless movement. As the last of the copper light faded entirely, the night settled around the sleeping camp. Heavy silence would return, a deep, hushed, ancient silence broken only by the soft footfall of the sentry's hand, the distant calls of the unknown desert. Creatures watching the army sleep, waiting for the morning light to force them once more eastward. Toward the bleached horizon, the sun was a hammer upon the high plains of Asia Minor. The heat relentless, a solid invisible weight pressing down upon the cloaked figures of the host. Dust was their constant companion, of fine pale silt kicked up by 50,000 feet and hooves settling onto the skin, like a shroud of powdered history covering the leather. The mail, the very air they breathed, They walked always, they walked the pace dictated, not by eagerness, but by endurance, the slowest. Oxen, the overburdened baggage trains, the lame pilgrims, their destination, still impossibly distant, still shimmering mirage beyond the next ridge, beyond the next burning horizon. Every step was a negotiation with the ancient earth, with the broken stone of forgotten Roman roads, with the sharp scrub that tore at the hems of their tunics. Armor was agony, not protection but punishment, the steel plates, absorbing the solar fire, turning the hauberk into a slow cooker of muscle and sweat lord. Godfrey rode near the vanguard, his face grim, etched deep with the knowledge that thousands had already perished not in battle, but through simple physical failure, through dysentery, through dehydration, through the slow consuming despair of the endless plain they had survived the passage through. Rum through the Sultan's lands where every shadow held a potential skirmish, but the landscape itself was proving the most formidable enemy, a vast, indifferent silence, demanding everything they had to give. The supply line stretched taut, sometimes breaking completely, and then the foraging parties had to range wider, becoming desperate, becoming violent, sometimes taking what was needed from villages that wished them only ill. The hunger was a dull, persistent ache, a constant reminder that their bodies were burning fuel faster than the meager rations could replenish. The water skins emptied quickly, and the search for fresh sources became a panicked necessity. The discovery of a running stream was a momentary miracle of cold, pure sound dissolving into the overwhelming quiet of the land. They moved from dawn until the light failed, then halted in disorganized camps that smelled of sweat, of dung, of smoldering damp wood. The sound of the march itself was hypnotic, a low, continuous hum, the creak of the wooden wheels, the occasional shout swallowed instantly by the scale of the landscape. The rhythmic scrape of 10,000 boots against the gritty earth. This was not glorious conquest. This was grinding inertia. This was the slow, relentless physics of moving an entire medieval society across a hostile continent. Night brought a hushed quiet broken only by the snorts of the horses and the low murmur of prayers whispered into. The cool air above them, the velvet sky, was startlingly clear of the constellations. Sharp, cold, distant, unconcerned with the suffering. Below the campfires burned down to glowing beds of amber coals, casting flickering shadows onto the gaunt faces of the men, faces that looked decades older than they were, hardened by the sun and the lack of sleep. They slept sometimes only 3 or 4 hours, then the horns would call them awake before the light could even reach the valleys. Another day of dust, another day of sun, another day of the same exact slow movement southward and eastward. They dreamt of water, of green fields, of the cool air of their homes, but the reality of the tent, the smell of their unwashed bodies, the pervasive dryness of the throat always dragged them back into the waking nightmare of the road. They crossed passes that seemed carved by giant. The path winding upward, impossibly steep, testing the legs of the horses and the patience of the drivers. When they reached the summits, the wind tore at their banners, whipping the sacred cloth into violent, frantic shapes, but the view was never encouraging. It was only more land. More miles, more endless rolling hills stretching toward nothingness. Every day a small number of souls slipped away silently, leaving their burdens by the roadside. Becoming of the stone, of the dust, the priests offered swift final rites. Their voices weary, heavy with the accumulating tragedy of the march. They could not stop. They could not linger, for to stop was to invite sickness, to invite the enemy, to invite collapse. They were driven forward by the singular, uncompromising oath taken months before. Back in the soft green fields of France or the colder reaches of Flanders, they were moving toward the Holy Sepulchre, and that single point of faith provided the necessary and terrible momentum. The ancient roads they followed were thick with history-forgotten armies. Forgotten empires had trod this same unforgiving ground sometimes. They passed ruined, vast, silent stone cities abandoned centuries ago, their walls etched with time standing as grim warnings of human impermanence. The pilgrims stared at these ruins, wondering if their own massive effort would leave nothing behind. But another layer of dust, another forgotten story. The heat intensified as the summer months wore on, and the lack of reliable rivers became critical wells. Were guarded fiercely, sometimes fought over the meager, brackish water tasted of mud and despair. But it was life, it was the only thing preventing them from collapsing entirely. The leaders knew they had to reach the coastline soon. Cilicia beckoned, promising relief from the plateau, the promise of ports and the hope of resupply from ships, but the mountains still stood between them and the sea. A colossal barrier of rock. They started rationing the wine. It was thin and sour, but provided a temporary mental lift, a brief blurring of the edges of their exhaustion. The common folk, the women. The children who followed the soldiers suffered the most, their sandals worn through their feet. Bleeding constantly, they wrapped them in strips of cloth, stained red and black. Their silent suffering was often harder to witness than the loud complaints of the armored knights, who at least had strong horses and stronger armor. The sheer administrative complexity of the march demanded ceaseless attention. The counts and dukes met nightly, their cloaked figures huddled over maps drawn on parchment, discussing forge routes and potential ambushes. Beaumont of Tarento, ever pragmatic, ever watchful, sent scouts ahead days in advance, demanding reports on water sources and defensible camping spots. Raymond of St. Gilles, the richest and most powerful, kept his massive personal retinue disciplined. His men were veterans of the Reconquista, and their silence was heavier than the noise of the others. The constant proximity of so many different cultures, so many jealous leaders, created friction. Small sparks of resentment that occasionally flared into brief, violent brawls over a piece of meat or a place near the fire. These fights were quickly suppressed. The greater cause demanded unity, but the strain was showing. The veneer of shared piety was thinning, revealing the sharp edges of human ambition and fear underneath. They marched through forests of scrub oak, the leaves brittle underfoot, the ground rising and falling in endless undulations. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and dry earth, a scent that promised nothing but more arduous travel. The animals were suffering terrible losses. The horses grew thin, their ribs showing. The oxen slowed to a near standstill. They had to be constantly urged forward, their eyes dull with fatigue. When an animal finally dropped, it was quickly butchered, the meat tough and scarce, providing only a momentary boost to the rations before the march resumed. The silence of the local inhabitants was perhaps the most unsettling feature of this stage of the journey. They passed through areas where the villagers had fled, abandoning their fields, leaving only the echo of their departure, the doors hanging open on empty homes. This emptiness meant they could not resupply locally, but it also meant they were relatively safe from attack. Yet the silence felt sinister, like waiting for a trap to spring. The feeling of being deep within a hostile land, thousands of miles from any help, was a cold fear that settled into the bones during the long watches of the night. The moon rose a silver disk in the dark sky, watching the silent columns crawl across the land like insects. They prayed for rain, for shade, for softening of the earth, but the heavens seemed deaf to their pleas. The sun was their ruler, their tormentor, the constant measure of time. The dust settled into the folds of their clothing, into the creases of their eyelids. It coated the bread they ate, turning every meal into a gritty experience. They learned to live with the dust, to accept it as an extension of their existence, the pale brown mask that covered every crusader, every cart, every banner. The rhythm of the march became a strange kind of meditation, the mind empty save for the necessary details of lifting the foot, placing it down, avoiding the sharp stone, adjusting the strap on the shoulder. This hypnotic repetition was perhaps the only way to endure the sheer scale of the task. The distance was so immense that thinking about the destination was crippling. They focused on the mile in front of them, the shade of the next boulder, the taste of the warm water in the canteen day. Melted into day, week into week, the calendar became meaningless. Only the sun's position, the state of their supplies, and the endless forward movement mattered. The ancient stone walls of the mountains began to loom larger, now signaling the change in terrain, the gradual ascent toward the passes that led down to the lowlands. These mountains were treacherous, unforgiving, the paths narrow, forcing the massive host into a long single file, snaking line stretching miles across the rough slopes. The air grew thinner, but the heat persisted. Trapped between the rocky faces, they were constantly wary of ambush. Here the narrow defiles, perfect spots for hidden archers, but the local resistance seemed fractured, scattered, exhausted by their own wars. The landscape itself was now their main assailant. Giant boulders, loosened by time, tumbled down the slopes, sometimes crushing men or horses without warning, the sound of the hammers ringing out as the smiths desperately tried to repair broken axles or sharpen. Blunted swords was a persistent soundtrack of necessity. Their meager tools were wearing out. Their shoes were dissolving, their weapons required constant maintenance, everything they possessed was degraded by the march. The steel pitted, the leather cracked, the fabric faded and torn, had become walking relics of themselves, figures forged entirely by hardship. When they finally reached a high mountain plateau, the wind offered a brief reprieve, a cleansing sweep that temporarily pushed the dust from their eyes. They saw far below them in the hazy distance the unmistakable deep blue line of the Mediterranean, a sight that brought an audible gasp of relief from the ranks. It was the sea's salvation, the pathway to resupply the tangible proof that they were moving out of the endless interior. Yet the descent itself proved agonizing. The path uneven, slick with loose scree, the slope so steep that the horses had to be led carefully, inch by slow inch. Baggage carts overturned with sickening crashes, sending their contents tumbling down the rocky slope, losing precious goods, books, relics, medical supplies. The men's knees trembled with the sustained effort of braking their weight on the downhill path, the muscles screaming in protest after months of flat or uphill travel. This was the Taurus Range, a legendary barrier, and it demanded its tribute in lost supplies and strained bodies. As they moved lower, the landscape changed. The sparse, arid earth gave way to scattered olive trees and patches of green, a hint of moisture clinging to the valleys. Air grew humid, heavy, with the smell of damp vegetation, a welcome change from the dry furnace air of the plateau. They started to encounter small running streams, small trickles of clear water that revived the spirits like a sudden, unexpected miracle. The discipline loosened slightly here, the men rushing forward to plunge their faces into the cool water, their thirst an overwhelming physical need. They rested for a day in a sheltered valley, allowing the exhausted oxen and horses to graze on the sparse but accessible grass. The leaders took stock, their numbers significantly reduced since leaving Byzantine territory, but the remaining men were the true survivors, the hardened core of the army. They were moving into Cilicia. The plain stretched before them, promising easier travel and the goal of capturing Tarsus or at a crucial staging post before the final push south. But this territory was disputed, held by various Armenian Christian principalities and sometimes claimed by Turkish groups, creating a dangerous mosaic of alliances and hostilities. The leaders realized they could not simply march through. They needed allies, they needed supplies, and they needed to maintain the illusion of overwhelming strength. Godfrey sent envoys ahead, attempting to negotiate passage and purchase food from the local Armenian rulers, Christians. They might be, but they were wary of this vast, hungry army passing through their lands. The nights in the valley were calmer, the sound of the nearby sea, a faint, continuous roar, a comforting presence. Fires burned bright, reflecting off the ancient stone walls surrounding their temporary camp. They spoke in hushed tones of what awaited them, of the cities they would conquer, of the riches they might find, of the glory they would bring home, but mostly they spoke of food, of bread baked fresh, of cold wine, of meat that was not stringy and tough. Physical reality of the crusade was always the most dominant force, overriding faith, overriding glory. The velvet darkness of the mountain night pressed down, cloaking the valleys in deep shadow. Stars seemed closer, now watching them as they slept, their faces serene for the brief period of unconsciousness. They rose with the sun, invigorated by the short rest, and began the final push out onto the Cilician plain. The change in pace was immediate, the ground flatter, softer underfoot, the dust slightly mitigated by the proximity of the coast. The host spread out, the different contingents moving slightly apart, reclaiming the space they had lost in the mountain passes. The sense of anticipation grew palpable. They were nearing the first major objectives. Tarsus, the city of St. Paul, was within striking distance, but the journey remained arduous. The heat of the plains was suffocating, worse than the high plateau heat, because it was humid, stifling, clinging to the body. The mosquitoes emerged in swarms, bringing new miseries, new fevers, new sleepless nights. The leaders worried about logistics. They could not besiege a major city with such depleted stores. They needed time to gather strength and secure a foothold. They marched toward Adana, a city known for its river and its fertile lands, a place where they hoped to rest and replenish Knowledge at the end. Goal is still months away, however tempered the temporary joy of reaching the plains. They still faced the great challenge of Antioch, the massive, impenetrable fortress that guarded the route to the Levant. But for now, they savored the small mercies. The flatter ground, the sight of green trees, the cool breath of the sea carried inland on the evening wind. Slow grind continued one foot after the other of the rhythm. Eternal, inescapable, binding them all to the sacred and terrible purpose of the march. They were an ocean of iron and sweat, moving with the agonizing slowness of historical inevitability towards the ancient stone heart of their faith. The sun climbed high, bleaching the world, white making the shadows sharp, brief retreats from the oppressive light. They saw the first walls of an outlying fortress, a sign of human civilization after weeks of wild remote travel. Fear and the hope mingled in the bellies of the men. They knew battle was close. They knew death awaited, but so did the fulfillment of their vow. The pilgrimage was transforming into and the weight of that transformation pressed heavily upon every weary soul. The amber light pulsed slow and deep beneath the solace of their weary boots. A hushed radiance spreading across the ancient stone walls, etched with symbols no human tongue remembered. The chamber breathed a slow velvet sigh, air thick and warm like aged wine. A sweet dust settled on the tongue. The shift was subtle, only a tremor in the deepest of the earth, not loud, not sharp. Just a sustained resonance that hummed against the ribs. The light gathered, shaping itself into a form, a massive ring of petrified wood, or perhaps bone twisting, slowly revealing a central well, a void of absolute dark, blacker than the starless night. They stood at the rim, peering into the endless drop. The air grew cold, now sharp with the scent of ozone and metal cold that bit the exposed skin. They knew the way forward was down a dangerous passage, perhaps into the heart of the world itself. The cloaked figure who had guided them until this point lifted a hand, shadowed and thin, pointing toward a single etched step carved into the inner curve of the well-smooth obsidian, slick with the condensation of Centurius. They began the descent step by careful step, the stone cold, unrelenting, the only sound, the shallow rasp of breath against the immense silence above. The amber glow faded, leaving them suspended in the deep dark, guided only by the ghost light that clung to the ancient carvings. The drop seemed infinite. Hours passed, or maybe minutes' time lost its anchor down here in the deep. They felt the pressure building, a weight pressing against the eardrums. 1,000 leagues of mountain above them. Then the humming intensified, no longer a vibration, but a sound, a choral drone, low and resonant, a sound made not by human voice, but by massive stone shaping the air itself. Steps ended abruptly. They were farmers and craftsmen, now soldiers, suited by the relentless rhythm of the road onto the ancient trackway. Stones hard and unforgiving beneath their worn celeste. This path had seen so much history. Hittite armies, Greek settlers, Roman legions. It swallowed their passage, easily indifferent to the fervent belief that drove them. First hour of the march was always a silent suffering, legs stiff, the muscles reluctant, slow creaking of the cartwheels, dry rhythmic grinding, sound of metal on metal, the sound of history continuing its steady course. Dust rose instantly, a fine persistent cloud reddish brown powder kicked up by thousands of boots. It coated their cloaks, their hair, their weapons, turning the whole column into a moving sculpture of earthy breath. The land they conquered, a constant intake of grit and dried clay. Sun climbed quickly, losing its amber globe, coming harsh, white or blazing down from the washed out, immense sky shadows shrank, hiding close to the moving feet, offering no respite. Teth's pace was slow, agonizingly slow. Careful conservation of energy every step, measured every downward pressure of the heel. A decision against fatigue. They did not hurry toward Jerusalem, they simply endured. The Distantia landscape stretched endlessly before them, rolling hills of baked yellow grass and thorny scrub. No trees, no shade, only the vast emptiness, broken occasionally by a cluster of jagged stones or the skeletal remains of a long-dead animal, picked clean by the vultures circling patiently far above mine, sought distraction in the monotony counting steps, counting breaths, counting the links in the chainmail of the man I had left. Right, left, right, the simple mantra of survival, hypnotic rhythm that carried them forward, disconnecting the body from the paint. Vision of the holy city shimmered distantly in their thoughts, not as a physical location, but as a shimmering concept of reward so profound it had to justify this daily humiliation test. Grinding endless tedium, leaders rode ahead their horses, kicking up the thickest dust Godfrey of bullion. Baldwin of Flanders figures of iron resolved their faces, shielded from the sun higher. Determination, the fragile compass that guided this immense. Suffering body, the past remnants of earlier civilizations, a broken archway, a collapsed, well-ancient stones etched with symbols they could no longer. Red layers of forgotten power proving that all journeys eventually end in all earthly strength. Eventually dissolves into dust. Sun began its steady climb toward the zenith. Heat increasing with merciless intensity sweet. Broke out immediately, stinging the dust on their brows, running down into their mouths, tasting of salt and metallic. Silence of the dawn was gone, replaced by the labored breath of the army, panting of the oxen, the persistent buzz of the fleece, the creak of leather, the inevitable small complaints whispered low, but always the dominant sound was the movement. Thousands of feet grinding the stone into powder lift, right, left, right. A ceaseless, relentless prayer carried on the hot, dry, windy. Walked through the midday, glare through your shoulders, aching beneath the Verdante shields. Felt heavier the steel helm. Felt like a furnace at the horizon, refused to bend, refused to offer anything new, just more dust, more sun, more ancient, unforgiving stontus. Was the true trial of faith not the fury of battle, but the slow, patient decay of hope under the weight of distancity? Saw another group approaching, a small band of pilgrims, perhaps, or messengers, cloaked figures moving rapidly there. News was always the same hardship, the headwater, scarce the path blocked yet. The column did not pause if they simply absorbed the bad news, and continued their slow, measured gait. Unbroken, they had moved beyond listening to hardshipy or hardship itself. Moving forward a river of determined metal and human will flowing, slowly, irrevocably toward the distant sea they were 3 hours into. The march, now stiffness, had given way to a dull, persistent, throbbing thing. First signs of dehydration began to set Leah dry. Metallic taste in the mouth, a slight disorientation at the edges of the vision. They passed a small trickle of water immediately. Surrounded by frantic, thirsty men, the stream was barely enough to wet their palms. A quick sip, a moment of false hope before the captains pushed them back into the link. Conservation was paramount. They moved on, leaving the dry ground behind, moving into a narrow, dusty gorge light here, with sharp bounced off the high stone walls, blinding and relentless. Stone walls were tall, etched with millennia of wind erosion. They funneled the heat, trapping the Crusader. She walked single file now along the rough path, rhythmic clang of their poleaxes hitting the Insomnia. Hollow reverberation through the valley. This was the slow path of pilgrimage. Penance measured not in prayer, but in the burning mileage of the foot they had left the green lands. Long ago they lived in a world defined by the color brown stone, brown dust, brown dried blood. Sun continued its merciless arc, watching the slow crawl of the faithful Beloweech. Man, a small dark speck of ambition and fatigue moving across the vast indifference of the earth. Jerusalem was a dream. Walking was the only real lidith. Leader raised his hand. Signal for a brief pause. Noise died, instantly replaced by the ragged gasps for air, sound of exhausted men simply trying to breathe beneath the weight of the sky. They leaned against the sun-warmed stone, whilst their eyes closed, seeking the momentary darkness. Dust still steadily around them. They were less than halfway through the day's expected journey, and the strength was already running. Thin air hung heavy, a moment of absolute stillness before the command was given to lift the shields, to shoulder the burden, to begin the slow, patient, grinding walk toward the unseen city. Holy dust clinging to their skin like a shroud, they were ready for the next step. The dust was the color of tired bone. It rose with every weary step, a fine pale powder lifting slowly into the hot air above the marching column. It clung to the sweat-soaked wool of the surcoats. It coated the lips and filled the nostrils of the horses. The air itself tasted of grit and ancient dryness. Another morning, another dawn, broken by the heavy silence of thousands of men moving southward. Toward the shimmering idea of salvation. The movement was mechanical. Now rhythm of the march etched into the bones. A slow shuffle, a steady drag, a relentless forward pressure. The sun climbed high quickly, a copper disk above the gray landscape. Anatolia stretched out, a vast hostile silence around them. They were deep into the difficult heart of the land far past the relative comfort of the coastal towns. They were walking on history itself. The hooves crushed small fragments of stone remains of roads built by emperors centuries ago, roads that led east and south. Roads built for armies that were not theirs. The weight of the armor seemed heavier today. The chainmail felt like a cloak of heated lead. Against the shoulders, every movement required a conscious effort of will to lift the foot to place it down to. Repeat the endless cycle, a man whispered, a dry sound that dissolved, instantly swallowed by the vast indifference of the plain water. Was the only true luxury. Each soldier knew the weight of his water-skin canoe, exactly how much he had left measured. Sips against the hours remaining until the next hope for stream. But the streams were elusive ghost rivers, marked only by dry, bed-scratched earth, mocking their desperation. Air was hushed, except for the scrape of iron to low groan of the supply. Cart's occasional sharp command from a weary count or duke. Their leaders rode ahead, cloaked in a layer of worry. They understood the arithmetic of survival. They knew that every mile gained cost more than simple energy. It cost hope, it cost supplies. It cost the lives of the weakest. The path narrowed abruptly. They were entering a defile, a high pass between two ragged ridges of stone. The rock walls rose sheer and forbidding, casting deep, chilled shadows. Even beneath the midday sun, the column compressed itself tighter. Nervous energy vibrated through the ranks. Was the geography of ambush the perfect place for the Turkish? Skirmishers, swift and silent men who melted into the landscape. They gripped their spears tighter. Their eyes tracked the jagged skyline, watching for any sudden movement, a flicker of cloth, a glint of steel. But the silence held a deep, suffocating quiet, broken only by their own steady trudging. Stones beneath their boots were rough, gray, granite, uneven, sharp, unforgiving. A dropped waterskin was disaster. A twisted ankle was a sentence of abandonment. They moved with the disciplined caution of men who had seen too much death on the road. Sun began its slow descent, painting the high peaks in shades of fiery amber and deep bruised violet. Still they marched. They pressed through the pass, driven by the need to find a defensible place for the night, a place where the wind would not tear their meager tents. The cold descended sharply as the light vanished, the desert heat replaced by the biting mountain chill, a reminder of the merciless extremes of this journey. Finally they halted. The halt was not rest, it was organized exhaustion. The work of establishing the camp began immediately. The horses were tethered, the sentries were posted, fires were coaxed into existence, tiny, defiant blizzards in the immense dark. The smell of smoke and stale sweat and cooking barley mingled in the heavy night. Airmen clustered around the fire, seeking the warmth, psychological comfort of the light. They unrocked their rations, the hard, dry bread, the salted meat, eating slowly, deliberately, savoring their sustenance. Their faces, etched by the firelight, looked ancient, weary. They had aged 10 years since leaving Europe. The conversations were low murmurs, hushed praise of thanks for having survived this one more day. The thoughts turned inward. They thought of the leagues they had traveled, of the Danube, the endless. On a flat expanse, a massive hall larger than any cathedral ceiling, lost high above them. In the obscurity here, the air was different, heavy and metallic. The floor was not stone, but massive interlocking plates of dark iron rust, colored where moisture had touched it in epochs past. And in the very center of this iron expanse stood a monolith, a giant pillar of green crystalline substance pulsing slowly with its own deep interior light. This was the source of the sound, the heart of the sleeping machine, the whispering engine of the deep. The approached slowly, reverently. The light from the crystal pillar, washing over them, green and spectral, showed them the walls covered entirely not with hieroglyphs, but with complex geometric patterns. Lines and curves that seemed to move when the eye rested upon them, shifting their positions, silently illustrating a history told through mathematics. A silent chronicle of stars and civilizations long drowned. The sound felt like information, like 1,000 voices speaking simultaneously, but too deep for the ear to interpret. They touched the cool surface of the iron floor. It vibrated faintly, the power immense contained. But ready to surge, the cloaked guide knelt beside the monolith, tracing a line with a finger through the dust and revealing beneath a layer of fine silt a deeply etched groove running straight toward the far wall following. The groove was slow, work. The iron plates shifted beneath their weight, slightly unstable each. Footfall echoed falsely in the immense space. The sound of their own movement felt wrong, intrusive in this sanctum of deep time. They tracked the etched line across the expanse, the air growing colder, now the cold of preserved space, the cold of pure vacuum, protected from the decay of the surface world. The green light seemed to reach out and pull at them, demanding attention, demanding silence. The guide moved with practiced grace, a silhouette against the pulsing stone, moving like a shadow, detached from the constraints of gravity. They reached the far wall, which seemed seamless, solid, eternal, until the crystalline light caught the edge of a gap. A hair-length fracture too thin to see unless the conditions were perfect, the light refracted. Along the edges of the tiny opening, illuminating microscopic carvings within the gap itself, symbols. So small they required absolute focus to perceive not writing, but a cellular language. A key embedded in the fabric of the ancient stone guide. Pressed a point on the wall, and the iron groaned a terrible sound like giants, waking the wall retreated inward, revealing not another chamber but a shallow pool of liquid black, velvet water still and silent, reflecting the green monolith light. Above the pool was not water, it was stillness, distilled, absolute mirror stillness, its surface undisturbed for untold millennia, reflecting nothing of the present world, only the intense green light from the pillar. And in its depth they saw not there reflection, but something else, shapes moving slow, an ancient fish that swam in the void shadows of towers that stretched impossible heights. Forgotten cities of the deep past, swimming in that liquid darkness. Air grew unbearably sweet, intoxicating. Their minds slowed, their thoughts drifted, the line between looking at the past and becoming of the past blurred dangerously. They leaned closer, drawn by the quiet majesty of the reflected ruin, feeling the heavy pull toward that dark velvet surface. A sense of perfect peace threatening to dissolve their waking purpose. The knowledge contained in that pool seemed vast and limitless, a complete history, available simply by yielding to the pull of the surface. Humming stopped, abruptly plunging the hall into a vast, unnerving silence, save for the gentle lapping sound of the black liquid. A single wave, perhaps. A ripple from a creature stirring far, far below in the infinite reflected city. Thee stood mesmerized, cloaked in the green glow, the boundary of the world dissolving under the ancient spell. The surface of the black pool waited for the slightest touch, the smallest movement to swallow the present. Whole the knowledge of the centuries lay just beneath that silent black film, waiting for the seeker to give up everything to reach thee. Felt the cold seeping through their clothing, touching the heart, slowing the beat. The temptation immense, the pressure to step into the reflection was a physical force, a whisper in the deepest. Ere the air tasted of salt and distant rain, the echoes of the ocean that covered the world. Before the mountains rocily did not move, they only watched the shapes shift the buildings, rise and fall in the dark mirror, knowing that to lean in further meant forgetting the sun and the surface forever cloaked by the green light. Bathed in the memory of the truly ancient, the velvet water pulled gently, calling them to sleep in the history of the stone, waiting for the final drift into the unknown. Dark chill sank deep into the cracked earth, a cold older than the stone they rested upon the black velvet. Sky had yielded its final stars, leaving only a lingering darkness, heavy and thick cloaking the shapes of the sleeping army in mounds of rough wool and cold leather. The air was entirely Husheda, deep primal silence that swallowed the sound of distant wind and magnified the tiny noises of Lifea, dry rasping cough from the rear guard, soft shifting of chainmail, as a soldier unconsciously sought comfort, a comfort that did not exist on this hard ground. Remnants of the fires glowed low small amber eyes, watching the approach of the inevitable day. Smoke, no longer rising but clinging to the hollows of the camp, of pale blue film tasting of ash and half-burnt sage. Every body was a study in fixed exhaustion. Relentless mileage of the Anatolian plateau had turned muscle and sinew into painful cords. Ache was no longer a temporary visitor, it was the permanent resident of the Bonia. Slow thrumming reminder of the distance still left to conquer beneath. The wool blankets' faces were etched with dust, and fatigue gleams of worry deepened around eyes that had seen too much dry landscape too. Much sudden violence, too much endless repetition of. The march and the rest in the march sleep offered a tenuous hold, a shallow dip into unconsciousness from which the mind could be yanked instantly by the slightest sound of falling. Rock, a strange bird cry, the whisper of a sentry's bootone. Man woke slowly, lifting his head, neck stiff, protesting the movement, watched the embers. A hypnotized gaze searching the glowing heat for some memory of homia warm hearth. A simple meal, things that now felt like forgotten myths shifted his weight, the dry straw beneath him rustling like paper, his hand brushed against the handle of his battle-axe, cold iron. Reassuringly solid, his only true possession on this pilgrimage of suffering. Darkness was beginning to fade now, not by light, but by the sheer thinning of its own concentration. Eastern horizon was taking on a ghostly gray. First sign that the sun was preparing its daily scrutiny of their continued efforts. Cold deepened in response. Coldest moment of the night pressing down hard, as if the earth itself was reluctant to release them to the heat. 1,000 men felt the shift without. A word they knew, the moment had arrived, moment when the body must override its exhaustion and prepare for another 10 hours of forward motion. The captains began to stir, heavy sighs escaped their lips as they rose stiffly, fear. Legs unwilling to support the weight of their armor. Great siege master, hulking German. Ulrich stretched his scarred hands toward the ash rubbing them together, trying to coax feeling back into his numb fingers, muttered a prayer, not for victory, but for water. Slow, inevitable sounds of preparation began to build, scraping of metal against metal, the thud of wooden rations being counted. Out the high-pitched whine of the grindstone, yes, men sharpened their blades one last time before the day's travel, a ritual of hopeful readiness. Against unexpected skirmish, horses sensing the activity began to stamp and snort, their breath visible in thick plumes like small white ghosts hovering above their heads. Heavy draft animals already shouldering the burden of the carts, their harnesses jingling a low, melancholic music of impending labor, shield of a sleeping night lay face. Up near the tent, polite's surface, slightly etched with dirt, a simple cross painted onto the wood, faded and chipped it, caught the creeping gray light, a beacon of fragile faith in a landscape of granite practicality. World smelled of dried dung and ancient dust off cold metal, and unwashed but diacet was the smell of a massive army not marching to glory, but simply surviving the morning. First rays of genuine color arrived, a sliver of pale amber staining the farthest eastern mountain stern. The jagged peaks to shadowed bronzethus was the signal they needed, a daily confirmation that their goal lay somewhere beyond that light. Noise level increased from a whisper to a low roar of activity. Men tightened their belts, secured their bags, drank the last sips of thin sour wine or dirty water, knowing the next chance for liquid might be hours away. Mail shirts were donned, each link cool against the skin. A sharp brief shock of metal, the weight settled onto the shoulders, a crushing familiarity that became indistinguishable from the weight of their censer. The weight of their purpose helmets were strapped on, transforming individual faces into anonymous expressions of iron determination. Knights became towering, cloaked figures, their identity subsumed by the great collective movement. Call to form ranks was a series of clipped commands barked in French, German, and Latin. Low rumbling voice of the standard bearer's, hands already aching from the promise of holding the heavy silk. Bannerthy foot soldiers stumbled into formation, their lines ragged at first, then slowly gaining cohesion. 1,000 small acts of will, overcoming the body's deep reluctance. Balkan forced the vast city of Constantinople, now a distant shining memory. They thought of home, a place growing fainter with every step, a soft, comforting dream they struggled to hold onto. But home was not the goal. Jerusalem was the magnet, the single point of light pulling them across this desolate land. The commitment felt absolute, inescapable. They were bound by vows, by faith, by the heavy weight of shared suffering. Small group gathered near the center of a camp by a tired priest. His voice rasped but carried the cadence of ritual Latin words, echoing into the cold air, a momentary velvet softness in the relentless stone. Landscape Kyrie eleison. This sound was picked up by others, a low sustained chanta sound of deep human need rising toward the indifferent stars. The stars here were sharper, closer, immensia, ceiling of cold, brilliant diamond. Dust they watched the sky, waiting for the Mona, thin crescent promising faint light for the second watch. Sleep, when it finally claimed them, was heavy, and shallow a sleep of readiness where the mind remained half alert, listening for the rustle of the enemy. or the call alarmed. The ground was hard, unforgiving, pressing coldness through the thin blankets. Every muscle ached, every joint protested the long day's abuse. Yet they slept because the body demanded its momentary respite. Haze. The march required renewal. Hours later, the camp began its slow, grudging wakefulness. Dark began to thin at the edges, the deepest black retreating grappled by. A cold dawn gray. The air was frigid, sharp, biting. The ritual began. Rolling up the damp cloaks, saddling the horses, checking the weaponry. Supply masters counted the remaining flour. The dried pulse calculating the shrinking margin of survival. They found the remnants of the night's casualties. A few more who had succumbed to fever or exhaustion would be buried hastily before the sun rose high. The shallow graves were dug in the hard ground. A brief prayer, a hasty cover of stones. No time for mourning, no time for elaborate farewells. The march demanded speed. The need to reach a fortified town, a source of reliable supply before the desert fully claimed them. Leaders conferred quietly, their cloaked figures huddled together. They spoke of scouts of intelligence of the road ahead. They knew that Antioch lay somewhere in the unforgiving distance. Antioch, the mighty city, the key to the final approach, but the way to Antioch was guarded by hardshipy, heat by thirst, by the constant threat of Seljuk arrows. The command was given low and sharp. Front line began to move. The iron scraped against stone. The leather squeaked. The column stretched out, a gray serpent uncoiling beneath the pale, hesitant dawn. The sun rose, slowly transforming the gray distinto a warm copper wash. Another day had begun. The first miles were the hardest. The muscles were stiff. The joints protested. The chilled blood moved sluggishly. But the routine took over the momentum of the crowd. Asserting itself, they fell back into the hypnotic rhythm of the walk-a-pace. Neither fast nor slow, simply relentless. They entered a flatter region now. Mountains receded into a shimmering haze behind them. This was open country exposed to the full, brutal strength of the sun. There was no shade, no shelter, no hiding place. The wind began to pick up a dry, steady breath, carrying fine abrasive sand that stung the eyes. They pulled their hoods lower, shielded their faces with scarves. The silence returned, broken only by the sound. Their own progress. They walked in deep lines, shoulder to shoulder, a vast human machine, driven by a single religious imperative. They passed ancient ruins, scattered stones, marking forgotten towns that had seen countless armies come and go. The silence of those ruins was profound, a warning perhaps of the impermanence of human ambition, but they did not stop to reflect on history. They only focused on the next hour, the next mile, the next sip of water. Their focus narrowed to the immediate need. The leather of their boots wore thin, revealing the bare skin. Beneath every step was a minor abrasion, a gathering soreness. Pain in the feet became a constant, dull companion, a hum beneath the surface of all thought. They learned to ignore it, to compartmentalize the suffering, to let the pain exist outside the core of their resolve. Midday came a time of punishing heat. The column did not stop for longer. Brief rest in the full glare of the sun, just long enough to readjust the packs, to check the animals. The heat haze distorted the horizon, making distances deceptive. Every shimmering smudge looked like a settlement. Every shadow looked like a pool of water. They learned quickly not to trust their senses in this landscape. The earth was deceptive, the air was thin. With mirages, the leaders rode back and forth along their presence was a necessary structure. Bowman, the cunning Robert, the weary Godfrey, the steady hand. Each man carried the burden of hundreds of thousands of lives and the weight of history. On his shoulders, they negotiated the passage through small villages, or what passed for villages in this arid zone, exchanging whatever scarce coinage or captured goods they had for meager amounts of grain or rough flour. The interactions were tense. Swift, based on mutual suspicion, the local inhabitants feared the vast hungry army. Army distrusted the strange tongue and the unfamiliar customs. There's no kindness here, only transaction. The sun reached its peak and began its slow slide downward. Light took on that deep orange hue of late afternoon, the color of rust and dry blood. The shadows stretched out long and thin ahead of them, guiding them toward the west and south. The relentless thirst pressed upon them now. It was a physical ache in the throat and the chest, a constant internal fire that their small sips of water could not quench. Few men fell out of the line. The Sound of their collapse was barely audible. They lay where they fell, cloaked in dust. A brother or a friend might pause. Brief Lido offered the last drops of their own precious water in a moment of hushed, desperate charity, but the column could not stop. The main body marched on, leaving the sick behind, entrusted to the mercy of God and the eventual arrival of the rear guard. This was the harsh price of the pilgrimage, necessary winnowing of the weak as the evening cooled, the pace increased slightly. There was the urgency of needing to establish compost, needing to be secure before the darkness fully enveloped the world. They knew the night belonged to the predators, both human and animal. Stone beneath their feet became cooler, softer, now a slight change in the texture, indicating a shift in geology, perhaps. A sign they were approaching the promised riverbed. The sounds of the march intensified as the day ended. The heavy breath of the oxen, the rattle of the harness, low unified sound of shuffling feet. Was the sound of persistence? The first watch was set before the moon appeared. Torches were lit amber flames, casting, shifting, dancing light across the weary faces. The leaders gathered on a large map spread on a drumhead with routes and notations. They traced the path forward with dusty fingers. Antioch seemed incredibly far, a fortress city built of massive stone walls. It represented not the end of the journey, but the beginning of the real, struggling potential, long siege against the formidable defenses. They calculated the remaining fodder for the animals, the stores of dried beans, the dwindling wine supplies. Every calculation was grim. They were dependent on finding resources along the way, dependent on God, dependent on their own fierce discipline. Night deepened. The stars grew cold and sharp. Once more men huddled in groups, discussing the familiar worries, the lack of fodder, the fear of the Turk, the strange customs of the land. They spoke in hushed tones of the ancient legends, stories of their saints and martyrs seeking comfort in the great narrative of faith. The fires burned down to glowing embers, small hearts beating softly in the immense silence. The smell of wood smoke and damp earth filled the air. One man began to sing a slow, quiet hymn, the melody from his home village. It carried across the camp a thread of simple beauty. A moment of pure human connection. It was quickly silenced by a stern voice, the need for quiet caution overriding the need for song. The vulnerability of the sleeping army was paramount. The shadows cloaked the entire camp. The sentries paced slowly there, figures merging with the darkness, their eyes strained against the velvet black, listening for the subtle movements of the night wind or the softer step of an intruder. The exhaustion of the day settled into a profound ache. The sleep, when it came, was total, a temporary erasure of the world. They dreamed of green fields of cool water off the faces of their wives and children, dreams that were vivid and quickly shattered by the call to wakefulness, the cold pre-dawn air biting at the skin. The stars were fading rapidly now, the darkness giving way to the metallic gray of approaching morning. Another day arrived without fanfare. Routine resumed, the breaking of the fast, the hitching of the teams, the collecting of the dead, the silent understanding that they must move. With that stillness meant starvation and vulnerability. They drank the last of the cool water from the night's cassia. Brief moment of refreshment before the dry heat returned. The Count stood before his men, his voice low and steady, a simple invocation to the Lord for strength and perseverance. Then the forward momentum began, a shuffling sound of thousands of feet on the hard earth. The slow, inevitable push southward, toward the sea, toward the great walls, toward the distant shimmering gold. The dust rose the color of tired bone. The air grew thick with powdered silence. Silver dust of ages settled slow. Kalen S. breath was shallow, held against the weight of granite carved in shapes the eye forgot. He stood inside the hollow heart of stone, the chamber wider than the maps suggested. It was not gold or jewels that filled this space, but columns etched with endless looping script, the language of the first forgotten kings. A low hum